49 days after the real presidential election that produced the surreal result of a former First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State losing the Electoral College to a former TV reality star accused of defrauding students at a fake university who also happened to be caught on video boasting about his preferred methods of sexual assault, 49 days after that election, the theoretical Obama versus Trump presidential campaign has begun, and each of the candidates thinks he would beat the other.
I am confident in this vision because I'm confident that if I had run again and articulated it, I think I could have mobilized a majority of the American people to rally behind it.
Donald Trump, unsurprisingly, tweeted, President Obama said he thinks he would have won against me. He should say that, but I say no way. Jobs leaving, ISIS, O'Care, etc. And this afternoon, Donald Trump tweeted, President Obama campaigned hard and personally in the very important swing states and lost. The voters wanted to make America great again. President Obama has an approval rating of 56%. According to Gallup, Donald Trump's transition has an approval rating of 48%, which is the lowest approval rating for an incoming president in history. Donald Trump picked the single best day of the year to try to bury an important public announcement. His transition office announced on Christmas Eve that he intends to dissolve the Donald J. Trump Foundation, the very same foundation that is being investigated by the Attorney General of the state of New York, Eric Schneiderman. Attorney General Schneiderman says Donald Trump cannot dissolve the foundation as long as it is being investigated. The Washington Post's David Fahrenthold is a front runner for a Pulitzer Prize this year because of his reporting on the illegal practices of the Trump Foundation and the surprising fact that Donald Trump has contributed exactly no money to the Trump Foundation in the last 8 years. Donald Trump has not produced a single record of him making a single charitable contribution in the last 8 years. David Fahrenthold's reporting showed that contributions made by the Trump Foundation involved the use of other people's money contributed to the Trump Foundation, not Donald Trump's. Joining us now, Jared Yates Sexton, a professor at Georgia Southern University, and MSNBC contributors Josh Barro of the Business Insider and Yamiche Alcindor of the New York Times. Yamiche, this first of all, let's go to the Obama versus Trump presidential campaign. Each man has a theory about it. What is your theory of that theoretical campaign? Who would win it?
I can't say who would win it. What I can say is that Obama is, of course, imagining himself as the change candidate, the candidate who really came out in 2008 and blew Hillary Clinton out of the water. So I think he's looking at himself as someone who would be able to capture the hearts of Americans. However, a lot of the people that I talked to that were Obama supporters, I wrote a story about this, they are now Trump supporters. There are large counties that went for Obama and then switched to Trump. That tells me that Trump became the hot hand in some ways, and he became the candidate that people saw as a change agent, and he became the candidate that people thought were talking for them, and that was the working class people and people who really wanted something different in this economy. So I think it's really tough to say, of course, who would have won, but I think Donald Trump has a good backing in that he was able to kind of harness the Obama way of doing things and win this election.
Jared, what's your guess on the impossible theoretical if President Obama could have run for a third term?
Well, I'll tell you this, that would be a race that I'd really like to see. I think Obama definitely has shown a little bit of that spirit of the campaign that he had, and I think he really wants to put his message out there and really compete against Trump in the arena of ideas. And I think it would have been a very, very different campaign. It would have been a lot more in terms of Obama's sort of agenda. I think we would have talked a lot more about what has gone on these past 8 years, and I think that we would have looked at the country in a lot different way as opposed to how Trump painted this country.
Josh Barro, President Obama seems to think he would have done a better job connecting with those voters who did switch from voting for Obama to voting for Trump.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, look, Hillary Clinton almost won this election, so you only need to do a little bit better than she did to win it. And I think he would have done a little bit better. He didn't have the specific liabilities that she had. He was not under investigation by the FBI. He did not have a track record of 40 years of coverage in the media, partly unfair, partly, I think, quite fair, that I think created in the minds of a lot of people, they just didn't trust Hillary Clinton. At the same time, Barack Obama's approval ratings have been ticking upward over the last couple of years as the economy has improved. So, you know, why did the president say this? I think I would imagine that he is irritated that what was sort of a layup election ended up getting lost by his party. And I think he thinks correctly that if it had been in his hands, the outcome would have been different.
And Jared,
Can I jump in really quickly?
Go ahead, Yamiche. Go ahead.
I would just jump in really quickly and say that Hillary Clinton in some ways was running on a third term of Obama. A lot of the policy he was talking about, a lot of the things that she wanted to do. So it's really tough to think that Obama, while of course he didn't have the same, I would say, flaws as Hillary Clinton, the fact that she was trying to basically say, like, look at his record, I can do something similar to that, and that message did not really rile up as much people as she needed, tells me that Obama would still have a tough time running just on his record.
But Jared, Nate Silver says that it was the Comey letters, according to his polling analysis, that lost the Electoral College for Hillary Clinton. The Clinton campaign's own analysis says that it was the Comey letters. There would be no Comey letter factor in actually anyone but Hillary Clinton as the nominee. Barack Obama, a supremely talented performer out there as a campaigner. As Josh says, you just needed to do a little bit better. And that little bit better could be measured in, you know, how many letters from the FBI enter the campaign.
I think that's exactly right. And when you really look at the entire arc of the Trump campaign, his main message that he gave to voters was this idea of, corrupt Hillary. And I think that without that sort of easily told narrative that he had there and that he basically collared Hillary Clinton with, I think we'd see a lot different result.
All right, I'm officially calling the Obama versus Trump campaign for Barack Obama by a healthy margin. And Yamiche, we're going to leave you out of the voting on this. We understand your position. I want to get to a problem that developed over the weekend for the Trump campaign. And I have a problem actually reporting on this story. This is Carl Palladino, the clearly mentally unstable, extreme racist from New York State, who's a friend and supporter of Donald Trump, a very rich supporter of Donald Trump. I cannot read the things that he said about both Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, deeply racist, ugly things that the Trump transition team eventually came out and condemned. But Josh, we haven't heard anything from Donald Trump about this, and Donald Trump is pals with Carl Palladino, and Donald Trump finds time to tweet about Alec Baldwin's performances on Saturday Night Live and smaller things than that.
Yeah, although, I mean, the fact that the transition issued a statement condemning the remarks is more than they usually do. And so you saw Carl Palladino come out now and say that he didn't mean to send the email to the press. He just meant to send these racist comments to his friends. Carl Palladino is actually an elected official. He's a member of the school board in the city of Buffalo, and he was just reelected to that position narrowly, although his allies on the board lost their seats. So Palladino is actually accountable to voters. He's going to have to come up for election again if he wants to keep that seat. And so I think he felt the need to walk this back. And it's clear that the Trump people, I don't think we're going to see Donald Trump tweet about how upset he is with Carl Palladino, but that statement makes clear to me that the Trump people are not amused by this and don't view this as a politically constructive thing for them.
Well, Jared, there remains the question of where will Carl Palladino's seats be at the inauguration?
Well, see, that's the bigger question of it, too, right? It's this behavior by Carl Palladino is actually just sort of indicative of the ugliness that Trump has sort of, loosed out into the mainstream of America. I mean, it's been there for decades. You've heard conversations in private when people didn't think that they were being held accountable. These are the kinds of things that people said. These are the type of things that they would, pass around on the internet. And you look at what Palladino said, you have to think that Trump has some responsibility for changing the discourse in this country, to allowing this out from underneath the, underneath the surface.
And Yamiche, Donald Trump took Christmas Eve as the right moment to try to get out of the problem called the Trump Foundation. The trouble is the Attorney General of the state of New York is saying, no, you are not legally allowed to dissolve that foundation as long as it is under an investigation by the Attorney General.
It's a problem that's going to continue to plague Donald Trump. You mentioned the reporting from the Washington Post. At the New York Times, we were also doing a lot of that reporting. And really, this is it's just an example of the conflicts of interest that Donald Trump has. This charity, the fact that he was not using his money but other people's money, and he's saying on Twitter that all the money went to charity, but at least some reporting shows that it might have been used to pay off lawsuits. So this, I think, is just an example of what the issues that Donald Trump are going to have moving forward. I would think about that, also his real estate holdings, what he's going to do with these hotels, whether or not he's going to set up a blind trust, how his children are going to be able to kind of be his confidants while also helping run the business. I mean, there's just so many conflicts of interest here, and this is just one of them that's not going to go away.
Yamiche Alcindor, Josh Barro, Jared Yates Sexton, thank you all for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.